sliced in half and everything, and they could never solve it. So I guess my question is, there's so many old and even current unsolved FBI cases. So do those cases ever get revisited, or what happens to them, and roughly how many unsolved FBI cases are there?
There are a lot of cases that go unsolved, and the primary reason for that is the people that commit the crimes don't want to get caught. And this may seem like an obvious answer, but a lot of times people overlook that. If you're going to commit a murder or you're going to commit a robbery, you know it's against the law. And I haven't met anybody, save and except for one or two examples, where somebody wanted to get caught. We had a bank robbery case one time where somebody robbed the bank. They went outside and sat down and waited for us to come because he was homeless and he wanted to go to prison because life in a federal prison to him was better than life on the street. But aside from that, it's a very rare situation. Those cases remain open. There is a statute of limitations that applies to most cases. In a situation involving a murder, there is no statute of limitations, so the perpetrator can be charged at any point in the future once enough evidence linking them to the crime is developed, and that usually happens through forensic examinations. DNA has been the biggest boon to law enforcement in solving previously unsolved cases, and they all get revisited from time to time.
All right, yeah, want to just go down the line? You have yours?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Mine's kind of about murder as well. I'm very interested in like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, like serial killer kind of things. My question is pretty much if a lot of serial killers or just people who commit like extreme violence or like killings, do a lot of them have like mental illnesses or kind of like things like that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the motivations and factors that cause someone to commit serial crimes. The FBI established in the late 1970s what's called the Behavioral Analysis Unit, and that is a group of agents and investigators. I think there's a TV show about that too. I don't watch FBI TV shows anymore. I had enough FBI experience, but there's a show about that where they're portrayed in a favorable light. What they do in real life is not what's on TV. They do analyze serial crimes, and they do try and come up with reasons why these crimes were committed, how they could have been detected earlier, how they can be prevented. Anecdotally, I would say that mental illness of some sort is always a factor in serial crimes because normal people don't do that.
So my question was about a case involving Arnaldo Jimenez. He killed his then wife in his black Maserati a day after their wedding. And last year he was the top 10 most wanted in the FBI. So I was just wondering, they said that he is suspected to be in Mexico. So I was wondering, why are there so many most wanted cases? And is it because the country cannot be involved in a case that happened in the U.S., or how does that work?
There's jurisdictional issues. I'm familiar with that case. It actually happened when I was still on the job, and I did the initial press release on that. After committing the crime, which was murder, he fled the country. Now, because it was a murder is not a violation of federal law that the FBI has jurisdiction over. It's a state crime. I believe it was the Burbank or the Bridgeview Police Department were investigating that case. They identified him as a suspect. He was charged formally with the murder. They determined that he had fled the country. Burbank Police Department doesn't have authority to go to Mexico, so they came to the FBI and said, we would like your help in locating and bringing this person back to seek to stand justice. We don't have authority in Mexico either. It's a sovereign country. We do have agents assigned to over 100 countries around the world in U.S. embassies, and we work with them, work with the law enforcement agencies of the host country to solve these cases. So just like we wouldn't want the Mexican National Police coming to Chicago to arrest somebody that fled here after being charged with a crime in Mexico, the Mexicans don't want the FBI or the Burbank Police to come down to Mexico City and make an arrest. So we have to work through international partners. And it's just like anything. He committed the crime, he fled because he didn't want to get caught, he didn't want to suffer the consequences of his actions. And I'm sure while he was in Mexico, he was trying to avoid detection and avoid capture. Some people are more successful at that than others, but that's why we have a 10 most wanted list. We found that to be a very effective tool in seeking the public's help in identifying and locating serious criminals wanted for heinous crimes such as this.
Okay, Kevin.
So, this is gonna be like an old case, but when it comes to like usual protection of the president, the Secret Service handles it. But after the JFK assassination, how like intensive was it for the FBI to figure out who did it and find him and track him down and all that stuff?
Well, I wasn't there, so I
Well,
can
like-
only go by,
Yeah,
by what
but-
I know anecdotally. After he was assassinated, the Congress established what was called the Warren Commission, and their job was to review everything that happened leading up to, during, and after the assassination, and determine whether Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone or in concert with someone else, and if so, what were his motivations. The FBI was charged then, as they are today, with investigating crimes committed against a federal officer. The President of the United States obviously falls into that category. So while it was the Secret Service's responsibility to protect him, once he was assassinated, it became the responsibility of the FBI to investigate, to find out who did it. We did that in connection with, or in conjunction with the Warren Commission. And all the results of our investigation were turned over to them, and they did a final finding.
Yeah, what's your question?
So mine, I found it in a specific case, but it's more of a general question. Just like if, so like a victim in a case, let's say that they maybe sent text messages that like weren't the best, or maybe even like photos or something, and now those are being used against them, and they're kind of saying that they're the victim and somebody is like, whatever, you know. And so are they at fault then for the things that they sent that are now being used against them?
So if I understand your question correctly, a victim of a crime, maybe an assault, a sexual assault, physical assault, they're the victim. So whoever committed that crime is responsible for that crime. There's no legal justification for them to do that unless they can prove self-defense. So self-defense has to be physical self-defense. You have to have an imminent threat of danger, physical harm to yourself or another in order to use any type of force and justify a self-defense defense. What the victim said or did prior to or after that is irrelevant in the legal sense. Did this person commit the crime? How did they commit it? How do we know we committed it? And why did they commit it? Now, they may have been upset because the victim put out text messages or photographs. You hear about revenge porn all the time, and that's a crime now in Illinois, but that doesn't give someone the right to take the law into their own hands and become a vigilante.
I was reading a story on the FBI website about a double agent who like was sending messages during like World War II to Germany and like kind of like throwing them off our trail and all that good stuff. But what I wanted to know is how common are double agents, both like from our end or other countries, and have you, in your time with the FBI, ever come across anything like that?
When I was with the Bureau, I worked all criminal cases. There's a whole nother unit of the FBI that works what's called foreign counterintelligence. Their mission is to identify representatives of foreign countries that are in the United States to conduct intelligence gathering information. It could be intellectual property theft. It could be military property theft. It could be recruiting government officials or employees of tech companies to divulge confidential information and to try and thwart that. Conversely, when we identify somebody that's working in that role, it's very common to try and what's called turn them. And now, instead of being prosecuted in the United States for espionage, they're now tasked with providing false information to their host country and or being used to gather intelligence from the host country that the United States can use. Most of the cases that take place you never hear about. If there's not a criminal case, if there's not a charge filed, it just goes unreported because there's no public record.
Okay, Tom?
Alright, one of my cases, it's a little different from what you've been hearing about murder. One thing I noticed a lot is that the FBI investigates piracy cases, like film piracy. One of the ones that I uncovered was that there was a lot of distributing of pirated copies of movies in LA in 2009. But my biggest question is, how long do some piracy cases last until the thief is caught?
Piracy cases are generally pretty easy to detect. because they've made bootleg, what's called bootleg copies of a DVD. You don't see that as much anymore because how many people are watching movies on DVDs?
Not as much
Not
anymore.
many.
We have
So,
Netflix and all that.
yeah, technology has pretty much made that type of crime a non-issue. But there's still ways that intellectual property can be stolen. The producers of it, the movie studios, for example, are very concerned about it. They don't want their intellectual property to be stolen and sold online. And I know that does happen from time to time. The problem with digital crimes, if you were to steal a copy of a movie that hasn't been released yet, and you were to make it available on your website, there's a digital trail that's gonna lead back to you. So it's generally pretty easy to trace that back and to identify who's responsible for that and make an arrest and file charges.
My story's a little bit off the green too. It comes from early November. The headline reading, "Man convicted and sentenced for stealing endangered animal from California Zoo." My question coming out of this is just, was there a case you investigated that was bizarre, odd, or just kind of threw you off your game?
Every case was unique. The one you're referencing, it may seem odd that the FBI would investigate that. What is the reason that we would investigate that crime?
Stealing anything from the zoo is a federal crime.
Because Congress enacted a law, it's called part of the Endangered Species Act. So in cases like that, and they're very rare, but they do come up from time to time, we would be charged with investigating someone who killed an endangered species, who imported exotic animals illegally. Those are all crimes under federal law that are punishable by imprisonment. As far as other cases that are weird and strange, probably the strangest one I had was a bank robbery. There was a segment on a radio show a few years ago, and we're actually going back a little bit farther, a few years, but it was a call-in talk show in the morning, and the topic of the day was, what's something that you did that got away with? And somebody called up, knowing that they were live on the air, and they talked about a bank robbery that they committed 6 months earlier in Homewood with 3 other people, and they were laughing that they got away with it. Well, one of our agents was listening to that on the way in the morning, and we went back to the station. We were able to identify who the caller was through phone records. Case solved. So that was pretty weird.
That's a freebie.
Yeah.
Very nice.
I'm doing my story like on the Silk Road investigations and how they bought and sold like multiple drugs and sold Bitcoin and all that. So my question was like, how far can like undercover FBI go to get a bust in an investigation?
Using undercover agents, whether it's a sworn law enforcement official or a private citizen that's working with law enforcement in an undercover capacity, is a very common law enforcement technique, and it's approved by the courts. People that commit crimes are doing so with who? With other people that commit crimes, right? They're not going to deal with average citizens, honest citizens, with law enforcement officials. There are limits and restrictions that are placed on agents and operatives working in an undercover capacity. They cannot commit crimes of violence. In most cases, you cannot distribute illegal drugs. You can have what's called sham drugs if you're doing a drug transaction. And to commit what's called ordinary criminal activity, say accepting wagers on sporting events, or I'm just trying to think offhand, non-victimless crimes, you have to get Department of Justice authority to do that in advance. You can't come back after the fact and say, oh, I had to steal 2 cars last week to keep my cover up. Well, you do so after the fact. It's not generally acceptable.
So I'm doing a case on 2 people that were arrested in Rockford last week. They found 10 handguns, 100 grams of crack, 90 grams of heroin, and then 4.5 kilos of marijuana. With the marijuana, I know it's still federally illegal and everything like that, and it was way over the 30 grams of legalization. But with all those marijuana cases that the FBI might be investigating, have they kind of put those kind of towards the bottom of important investigations, or are they still using them to find the bigger drugs like the cocaine, like this instance where they had more than just the marijuana?
Well, this is a situation where knowing and understanding the federal and state judicial system is really important. The FBI doesn't have jurisdiction to investigate individual drug crimes. We can investigate cartels, international organizations that bring large amount of drugs into the country, or street gangs in Chicago that are organized and they use drug sales as a means of supporting themselves and as a source of funding. The case that you're talking about, I'm pretty sure, I'm not familiar with it, but I'm pretty sure it was conducted by local authorities.
It says, it was on the FBI.
Was it on the FBI
Yeah.
website? Okay, so it was an FBI investigation. There's probably a next to a cartel as part of that case. And again, in Illinois, the marijuana law has very low limits where it's now legal for recreational purposes. If you're talking 4.5 kilos, that's way over and above what is a legal limit. And now that it's legalized and that it's being taxed by the state, there's even more emphasis, I think, being put on detection and arrest of people that are involved in the illicit sale of the drug, because in effect, you're taking money away from the state.